Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Here I am with the first 11 facts video of 2026, and this time I'll be taking a look at Atari's old portable gaming system, none other than the Atari Lynx. Rather than me doing a long, drawn-out, self-indulgent intro, how about we just get straight into the facts? Alright, already, let's get on with it. The Atari Lynx was designed by two key people that had worked on the Commodore Amiga and later the 3DO. You might think that the Atari Lynx was designed by some Atari engineers that no one ever heard of. If you think that,
well, you're wrong!
Let's kick things off with a pretty interesting fact here. I'm going to speak about two guys, RJ Michael and Dave Needle, whose names you might remember from some prior coverage I've done. These two really got around the computer and console scenes from the early 80s through the mid 90s. They both worked on the Amiga before the Lynx, and they both worked on the 3DO after it. And you can see my 3DO 11 facts video for more info about them. Now, Dave Needle designed the hardware of the Lynx, which included ensuring it had hardware to scale and distort objects, making games like Blue Thunder and Electro Cop possible. RJ Michael worked primarily on the software side of the equation, contributing greatly to the Lynx operating system, its user interface, and more. Now, if you go by Wikipedia and other modern internet sources, they state that Jay Miner, also known as the father of the Amiga, and David Morse, executive and co-founder of the Amiga company, designed the DMA driver for the Lynx. The problem is, that is almost certainly false. Jay Miner was spending his final days with Amiga/Commodore at the time, before leaving computers and video games behind to continue his work on medical devices. And Dave Morse, like I said, was an executive. He would schmooze with other executives and try to convince big companies to work with him and stuff like that. He would eventually become a software manager, who would also go on to found Crystal Dynamics. So where did this rumor come from? Glad you asked. Check out this issue of UK Ace magazine from August 1989. The best explanation I have for what happened is that they probably got the names wrong, and they were really referring to RJ instead of Jay, and Dave Needle instead of Dave Morse. They also misattribute chip designs to Morse for the Amiga when that's not what he did there. So remember folks, not everything you read or see on the internet is true. The Lynx was the first full-color handheld game system to use cartridges. The Atari Lynx was indeed the first full-color handheld game system that used exchangeable game cartridges to ever be released. Atari launched the Lynx in the US in the fall of 1989 for approximately $190. This was just a few short months after Nintendo released the original monochrome Game Boy for about $90. The Lynx had a whopping huge palette of 4,096 colors, out of which it could display 16 at a time. Now more than that, the Lynx also had a backlit screen, which also made it the first handheld system to have one of those. It was pretty impressive back in the day, although the screens were kind of dull and washed out looking. Still, this was 1989, which was 37 years ago as I record this, folks. Like most kids back then, or people in general fortunate enough to have a Lynx, I was super impressed by it, even though I thought the magazines of the day had maybe exaggerated some of its abilities. So the aforementioned game Blue Thunder was impressive for a handheld system of the time, but when I heard the Lynx was going to have hardware scaling, I guess I kind of imagined it would have the speed and fluidity of arcade superscalers like Afterburner, but really, it was quite different and it was its own thing. Now that minor disappointment didn't last too long, and we wouldn't see another game system able to effectively scale sprites and hardware until the 32-bit era, which was crazy as this seems, just about 5 years after the release of the Lynx. But we had a lot of systems without those scaling capabilities before then. And Super Nintendo fans, I didn't forget about Mode 7. Mode 7 only scales and rotates a tile map background layer. It has nothing to do with sprites. The SNES needed the Super FX2 chip to do sprite hardware rotation and scaling. And I'll have to put hardware scaling in quotes there, since for the Super FX2 it was built into individual games. But it was technically chip-based, so there was something physical, it just wasn't built into the system. The Lynx did not have a hard sprite limit. When we look at the hardware specs for systems that came out around the time of the Lynx, like the Genesis/Mega Drive and the PC Engine/TurboGrafx 16, we always see things mentioned like how many sprites they can render at a time. It's 80 in the case of Sega's 16-bit system, and 64 in the case of NEC's system. The Super Nintendo, released in 1991, 2 years after the Lynx, could handle 128 sprites. Now, you also had to deal with the limit of how many sprites were available on each scan line at the same time, which was a much smaller number for all systems involved. Now, the Lynx didn't work the same way as those systems. Neither did many arcade games, including very old ones. A lot of those classic arcade games in the Lynx technically had no fixed hardware sprite limit at all. Instead, sprites were essentially limited to how much memory you had available. Now, despite the seemingly big advantage in sprites, the Lynx also had a major drawback. Backgrounds in games were generally large sprites that required a lot of processing power to scroll. Because of a small amount of RAM shared among some major components, the graphics of the system were often bottlenecked, and most Lynx games ran at very low frame rates. How low? Generally between 15 and 30 frames per second, but they could get a lot lower than that. Now, on a slow LCD screen that had ghosting issues, it really wasn't that big of a deal contemporarily, but a lot of people today who try to play this system may be turned off by those low frame rates in some of its games, which, to bring things around to the fact here, was in part due to the way that the system handled sprites. The Lynx is an 8-bit system, or a 16-bit system. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Ah, the old bitness debate. I don't often hear people debating whether the Lynx is an 8 or 16-bit system. Usually bitness debates are the realm of the PC Engine / TurboGrafx 16, the Neo Geo, and the Jaguar. Let's take a look at what's inside and discuss it, shall we? First up, we have the CPU. It's a customized 65CO2 8-bit processor that runs at 4 MHz. It's kind of similar to what's inside the NES and PC Engine. It has a bidirectional 8-bit data bus, but with a 16-bit address space. The system also had a 16-bit blitter chip named Susie.
My name is Susie.
That ran at 16 MHz, which is what causes things to start to get a little bit murkier. But look at it this way. If we classify the PC Engine / TurboGrafx 16, which has an 8-bit CPU and 16-bit graphics hardware as an 8-bit system, then don't we also have to classify the Lynx as an 8-bit system as well? Personally, I say yes, but some people will disagree, and that's fine. No one has to fight or call people names, right? But in the end, the bitness of the machine matters less than the results it produced. The way I see things, the performance of the system overall is more on par with 8-bit hardware of the era, and that CPU was likely a very limiting factor on system-wide performance. So sure, it had fancy things like scaling, but these games, they don't feel like 16-bit games that we saw on, say, the Genesis and Super Nintendo. So whether you want to call the Lynx 8 or 16-bit in the end is up to you. I'm not going to fight anybody over it, but personally I would lean towards calling it an 8-bit system. The Lynx had some interesting hardware and software prototypes. It's always fun in these kinds of videos to take a look at what might have been. About 11 years ago, in the Lynx fans Facebook group, several photos were posted of RJ Michael with prototype Lynx hardware, and even a design document for the system and an empty shell for the original Lynx. Now look at that device he's holding. I can't imagine how that first device would have worked as a consumer unit. But hey, looks funky, so it's interesting to see, right? Now another thing with the Lynx is that there's no shortage of canceled games. The prototypes for many of which have surfaced online over the years. Just to name a few, there were arcade ports like Vindicators, Rolling Thunder, and Raiden in progress back during the system's lifetime, along with a host of other less familiar titles. Now Raiden, that one sort of had a real retail release from Telegames in 1997, but go ahead and play that game. It's missing half the levels. Tell me that's what the complete product was supposed to have looked like. It also doesn't have any music. Anyway, out of the group of prototypes, I think Rolling Thunder had the most promise. It's clear that this prototype is still very early, and yes, the frame rate is very low, but it plays fast and the controls, even in this state, are okay. It probably wouldn't have been a huge seller even in the most ideal of circumstances, but this is the one title out of this batch that I would really like to have seen completed the most. Ah well, what are you gonna do? The shape of Lynx cartridges changed over time. When Atari first launched the Lynx, and I can confirm this from first-hand experience, we got ours within a month of the launch, the original games shipped on very flat cartridges without any real grip near the top, and they were incredibly difficult to pull out of the system. You would not believe how hard it was to get these games out. There were times I literally just kept playing a game because I didn't feel like trying to take it out. Now that original and flawed cartridge design was followed by one that included some dots in the plastic of the cartridges near the top for better grip. And yes, these were absolutely better, but it was still pretty difficult to pull them out of the system's cartridge slot. All 5 of the original Lynx games had newer retail releases where the old cartridge type was replaced with the new one. There was also one new game that debuted on this type of cartridge. However, that redesign didn't last very long either. Atari moved to manufacture newer cartridges, a third design with a curved lip up at the top. These were vastly easier to take out and change, and finally made switching games as easy as it should have been from the start. All the games, and there were only a total of 6 titles that were originally produced on either the flat or dotted cartridges, were eventually replaced with curved lip versions at retail. Third time's a charm, I guess. There were only 72 official Lynx games released, but I usually tell you during these 11 Facts videos just how many official releases there were for a system in its commercial lifetime. Why change tradition now, right? So, believe it or not, even though the Lynx was on the market for about 6 years, there were only a total of 72 games released for it. Or 73 depending on how you count them. But anyway, let's look at the Jaguar for a second. The Jaguar had fewer games than the Lynx, even though it had a few good ones. Most of them were terrible, right? But on the Lynx, things are not quite so dire. While there aren't many I would deem absolute must-haves, most of the Lynx's library ranges from good to middling, rather than outright bad. And some were very visually impressive for the time of their release. Now, there are some standout titles for the Lynx, including the earlier mentioned Blue Lightning, Chip's Challenge, Ninja Gaiden, Clax, Shadow of the Beast, Toki, Checkered Flag, and maybe another 4 or 5 games that are quite good. Out of the rest of the games, I'd say most of them are kind of middling, like I said, and there are definitely some pretty rough ones. There are some games that are interesting to mess around with for a couple of hours, but there are not many where you'll get long-term enjoyment and want to come back to them over and over and over again. And I say that as somebody who has owned the system since it was brand new. Now take heart, Lynx fans, for the homebrew / small company / aftermarket scene for the Lynx has proven to be pretty decent, even if it's less active now than it used to be. Looking for a JRPG on the system that famously had none? Well, you might want to check out Wyvern Tales. And as I record this video, its prequel, Wyvern Tales Gaiden, is coming out in a few months, with an update from just over a week ago, and I've linked that update in the description. There are versions of Tetris, Lode Runner, Centipede, Solitaire, and more that have come out since the end of the system's commercial lifetime. You may not be able to find many of these physically anymore, but I'm sure the intrepid among you can find a way to play them if you really want to. The Lynx could be rotated for left or right hand play, or held vertically for some games. Any Lynx owner definitely knows this one, but the Lynx owning community is pretty small, so why don't I share this info with everyone, right? So the Lynx was the first major handheld that was designed to allow either left or right-handed play. If you wanted to have the control pad on the right side and the buttons on the left, you could just rotate the system and play that way. Some games would handle this and adjust the screen automatically, while other games required the use of a button combination to manually force them to rotate. The other neat trick you can do with the Lynx is rotate it 90 degrees and hold it vertically. A few games like Gauntlet 3, Clax, and that sort of semi-official write-in release required being played in this manner. I only had the original Lynx, I never owned a Lynx 2, and I can tell you that holding the original vertically to play games, it worked, you could do it, but it definitely wasn't the most comfortable gaming experience in the world. We wouldn't see another major handheld designed from the start to be played either vertically or horizontally for some time. The next one would be the Bandai WonderSwan, famously designed by Gunpei Yokoi, who had also designed the original Game Boy for Nintendo and had been the producer on the original NES Metroid. But the Bandai WonderSwan, well, that's a story for another time. Epyx tried to sell the Lynx to Nintendo and Sega before Atari finally bought it. Now we get into the fun stuff with this one. The Lynx was designed internally at Epyx, who had been famous for making software at that point. They'd made games like Impossible Mission, summer games, and winter games for platforms like the Commodore 64 and Apple II. On the hardware front, they'd put out the famous Fast Load cartridge for the Commodore 64 that helped decrease loading times for floppy disk-based games. They also produced a very unique joystick, as seen here, and I actually had some of these. We thought they were so cool at first, but they ended up being junk in the end and broke easily. The Lynx started development at Epyx under the codename Handy, after David Morse, might remember him from fact number 1, after his son asked if Epyx could make a handheld game system. The system originally being codenamed Handy, by the way, is also how the major Atari Lynx emulator Handy got its name, if you didn't know. Back to Epyx here. Epyx was in dire financial straits while designing the Handy, and was looking either to partner with another company to distribute it, or to sell the Handy straight up to them. Epyx approached Nintendo, who had shown zero interest in the project, probably because they'd already had the Game Boy in development for some time, and would be ready to launch it soon. Next, they showed it to Sega, who had expressed much more interest in the project. Sega had some detailed discussions where they asked how some aspects of the Handy worked, and they asked for technical design drawings and some other information. Sega was apparently pretty close to buying the Handy, but they passed to eventually put out the Game Gear instead. This rubbed designer RJ Michael the wrong way. But anyway, eventually, Atari ended up buying the Handy from Epyx and renamed it the Lynx, and the rest is history from there, right? Let's talk about that Sega link for a second. RJ Michael did an interview years after the system had been renamed the Lynx and it had lived and died, and that article is linked below where you can see the interview. And he accused Sega of stealing his design and using it for the Game Gear, and said the Game Gear was practically the same as the Lynx. According to Michael, the screen used the same display drivers, and he said the case for the Game Gear even had the exact same screw count as the Lynx. The problem is, neither of those claims exactly check out. The original Game Gear used 23 total screws for its assembly, the original model of the Lynx used 10. If we're talking about just the outer case, the Game Gear had 6, and the Lynx had 4. The Lynx 2 remodel had a total of 15 screws. So either way, that's quite a different screw count no matter how you slice it, if we're talking internal only or internal and external. Now the LCD screens for the two systems were also pretty different. They had different resolutions to start with. The Lynx screen was 160 by 102 and the Game Gear screen was 160 by 144. The Lynx screen was 3.5 inches versus the Game Gear screen, which was 3.2 inches. Refresh rates were also different. Even though most games ran at very low frame rates on the Lynx, as I mentioned before, the LCD actually supported refresh rates up to 75 Hz. The Game Gear LCD had a refresh rate that was pretty much locked at 60 Hz. So physically, these parts were not the same, and one does not work as a drop-in replacement for the other. Now who knows, maybe it's possible RJ Michael was referring to an earlier version of the Lynx, or he saw some Game Gear prototype or something. But the final devices were definitely quite different, and the internal hardware of the systems was entirely different, with the Game Gear being powered by a Z80, and as everyone knows, was essentially just a portable master system that got a boost to its total color palette and also stereo sound instead of mono sound, while the Lynx, aside from its CPU, used a lot of very custom parts. So these systems were really not that similar, except that they both sure did love to eat batteries. Most commercial Lynx games had a single executive producer. First off, Atari back in the days of the Lynx was still run by the Trammels. Jack Trammell had started Commodore and was basically run out of his own company, and then he purchased Atari when their star had fallen very far. He was known mainly for two things, being cheap and being rude. I talked about him in the Jaguar episode if you want more info on the Trammels. Now, one thing Jack, and by all measures his more pleasant son Sam, who had started running Atari, didn't grasp was the need for strong software to sell systems. After all, without Super Mario Bros., would the NES have taken off like it did? Probably not. And later on, would the Genesis, which Atari had passed on distributing in America, have gotten so popular without Sonic the Hedgehog? I think we know the answer to that. Anyway, Lawrence Siegel knew the Lynx needed software, and he tried to recruit third parties to work on the platform. The problem was that in those days, Nintendo still had a stranglehold on third-party licensees, and they couldn't release the same game on a competing platform for a few years. Atari sued Nintendo over the practice, and Siegel insists that this lawsuit was pretty much doomed from the start because Jack Trammell used the cheapest law firms he could possibly hire to represent Atari's interests. And to no one's surprise, Atari eventually lost that suit. Siegel felt that it should have been a slam dunk win for Atari, and would have been if they had had better lawyers. But the end result was that the Lynx had very few games, and Siegel had served as the executive producer for the majority of them from his Chicago office for Atari. How about some bonus facts about Siegel here? He had butted heads with the Trammels for a long time at Atari, but eventually even took a job as president of Atari. But his last straw with the company came in 1992. He didn't like that they were going and buying the hardware that was supposed to become the Panther. He thought that they had no games and it was going to be a repeat of the Lynx, and that things might be even worse now because of the state of the market, so he eventually left. And what did he do when he left? He formed Black Pearl Software, which ended up being gobbled up by THQ, where Siegel would remain for about 3 years after. The most valuable game for the Atari Lynx is currently a prototype of Relief Pitcher. As usual, I'll end this top 11 video with a look at what is currently the most expensive game to buy for the platform I'm covering. And there are some wrinkles this time. So price charting uses a standard format and includes different conditions for games. If we look at the top spot for the Lynx here, we have a game prototype, Relief Pitcher. The problem is, obviously you can't get that game quote-unquote new or quote-unquote complete in box, so those don't really apply here. Loose, this game goes for over $340. There's also a sale that happened for a quote-unquote complete version of the game, listed for $784.34. Now, if we limit this list to final released games, then we have to consider Lemmings, the most expensive game for the system. It goes for $699 new, should you ever manage to stumble upon it. Complete in box, it'll set you back $250, and loose, it drops to an almost reasonable $69.47. An interesting note here is that hardware-wise, the original model of the Lynx goes for considerably more than the more compact redesign, which includes a version that came with the system and Batman Returns. The original model is over $957 if you can manage to find it brand new. Not easy all these years later, but who knows. It's about $372.50 complete in box and $209 loose. The Batman Returns bundle is $583 new, just over $291 complete in box, and $131 loose. Which, I don't know, selling a bundle loose seems a little weird to me, but I guess it can be done. Alright folks, so there you are, 11 facts about the Atari Lynx you maybe didn't know, but now you know for sure, right? Tell me, what did you think of this one? Did you know this stuff already? Have you run into the misinformation in Fact 1 in the past? What did you think of the Atari Lynx as a platform? Did you have one? Did you want one? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere, and really help spread the word about the channel if you can. I get so many comments about this channel deserves more views, but the only way I'm gonna get them is with your help if you tell other people about it and post about it in other places. Because one thing YouTube has made abundantly clear is they're sure not gonna help grow the channel. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. As always, you can support the work I do here through Patreon or Ko-fi. And you can also support me directly on YouTube through things like super thanks or channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.